Breaking news in the trial of Officer Randall Carrick. We're getting information straight out of the courtroom this afternoon. It's 4:23. The jury has been deliberating for days now at this point, day 4, and the judge has just declared a mistrial. This after the jury came back earlier this afternoon saying they were somewhat deadlocked. At that point, we're hearing that the numbers were 8-4. Of course, we don't know on what side of the fence people were on. They then again went back after there was some sort of a pep talk from the judge at that point, went back, talked to him a little bit to see what was going on with their head. Right now, actually, I want you to take a look at this video because this is live from inside the courtroom, just minutes after the judge dismissed the courtroom, dismissed the jury, declaring this a mistrial. Just so you guys know, both sides asking for two different things. The defense obviously asking for a mistrial earlier this afternoon, the prosecution wanting the jury to go back and talk about this a little more. There seemed to be some sort of a deadlock, some sort of an impasse, and a reason as to why this jury could not come to a unanimous decision. They asked again, brought the jury back in just a few minutes ago, asked the foreman if the foreman thought they could at any point reach an agreement, even if they could sleep on it tonight, leave for the weekend, and come back Monday with a possibility of potentially reaching a unanimous agreement. That foreman looked right at the judge and said, "Unfortunately, I do not think that will happen." His exact quote was, "They've exhausted all options at that point." The prosecution did ask again, "We do want the jury to potentially think about this a little more, maybe go home for the weekend, think about it again." The defense coming back to say, "I really just don't think this is going to happen, and I just don't think the jury can come to an agreement." That point is when the judge stood up and said, "This is now declared a mistrial." Again, you're looking live right here from inside the courtroom. There you see Officer Randall Carrick. He's talking to his defense attorney. Right there, you see George Lawrence, his defense attorney, Randall Carrick, talking. The woman you saw just a second ago sitting next to Randall Carrick, that's his wife, and she had been sitting behind him, the second row of the courtroom, for the entire duration. Just to give you a little timeline, you guys, we are about to reach the 5th week on Monday. This coming Monday would have been the 5th week of this trial. 2 weeks of jury selection, finally reaching a group of 12 people. Jury deliberations started earlier this week on Tuesday afternoon. They deliberated all day Wednesday, all day Thursday. Today was when they did say they had reached a deadlock. Also, some numbers to give you before we go to an expert. On Tuesday, the jury was actually asked where they were as far as votes go. They were 7-5 on Tuesday. Then on Thursday, they were asked the same question. They were 8-4. And then again today, 8-4, to the point where they just said they cannot come to an agreement. We want to bring an expert here on the phone to kind of break this down and tell us what this means and any steps we potentially have to make in this trial. Of course, this has been all eyes on for the past few weeks. This is Quentin Williams. He's going to talk to us a little bit about what this means. Quentin, are you on the phone?
Yes, I am. How are you
Well,
today?
I'm good, thanks. You know, I think most people are shocked and kind of not really knowing what to do at this point. This case now declared a mistrial. It seems like the jury just cannot come to an agreement. Talk to me about your reaction.
I'm not all that surprised by it, to tell the truth, because from what I understand, they've been fairly deadlocked, whether it was 7-4 or 7-5 or 8-4. Those numbers have not changed much, and we don't know if it was 7-4 acquittal or 7 against acquittal. This has been going on for the last 3 days, and it appears as though it only takes one person not to agree to get a hung jury. So it appears as though they were really stuck. There were a few people who were really stuck on in their position and weren't wavering.
Earlier this afternoon, the judge brought them back in to gauge where they were at that point. That's when the foreman said, "You know, we actually feel like we're making some sort of progress. In fact, it may be positive progress." And so then he sent them back to the jury room to talk a little bit more. Do you think that at that point they thought they were maybe going to come to a unanimous agreement? And what do you think happened back in that jury room?
Well, I think the foreman was probably being optimistic, seeing that there were opportunities to bring everybody to one side. But you know, when juries start to think about the consequences of the decision, when jurors start to think about that, they waver sometimes. They vacillate, go back and forth. This is a heavy burden, especially when you're talking about a murder case, because you know that your decision is going to either impact negatively on the defendant or on the family of the person who was killed. And it's a tough burden to have to overcome. I am not surprised by a hung jury. I'm not surprised with the kind of evidence that we were presented with. This is why I think body cameras are so important, because it would have really played out the story a lot clearer, with much greater clarity than we have. And hopefully we'll get to that point in North and South Carolina very soon, where everybody has a body camera.
We heard the judge say just a few minutes ago, we obviously want to talk to the jury. The attorneys are going to want to talk to the jury because at this point, we don't know who was about to say he was not guilty and who was about to say he was guilty. Now, after we hear from those jurors, what happens at this point? What does this mean for Randall Carrick and what does this mean for the Farrell family?
Well, the prosecution has a decision to make. What are they going to do? Are they going to, invest the resources back into prosecuting this case again? Starting all over again. In some way, it helps both sides because you know what the arguments are going to be, and you try to find a way to overcome those arguments. So it might make one side stronger than it was in the past, but there's still a lot of resources that have to be poured into this in order to prosecute it again. I don't know what they're going to do, given they're going to balance out the amount of resources necessary versus the if they don't do it, what the public is going to what the outcry will be. So the response from the public is going to be very important here, and I'm sure we're going to see a very strong response in that respect from both sides.
You speak of resources. Just last night, I was speaking to Charles Keller, who's the court administrator over there. He was giving me a guesstimate about how much this trial has cost to date. It was somewhere around the $150,000 range, and that was not including the cost of facilities and the cost of the jurors. So, of course, there's that financial burden that people have to think about before this could potentially start all over again. If the prosecution decides not to retry this case, what happens to Randall Carrick? What does this mean for him?
If they don't retry it, I don't think there will be a federal civil rights case prosecuted in this instance. It doesn't appear as though the federal government, the Justice Department, is willing to do that, and that means that he doesn't get prosecuted.
Okay. Quentin,
That's the end of it.
I'm sorry, I just have one more really quick question. We've all been talking about how this trial is maybe going to change the scope of our local police department, change the scope of police departments all over the country. That was sort of contingent upon what the outcome was as far as the verdict is concerned. At this point, do you think that this trial is going to potentially change the policies at CMPD, change the policies maybe in other parts of North Carolina? What do you think?
Police departments always look at for historical value. They always look at cases in the past, both within their police department and outside their police department. They will use this as a case of study, so that whatever happened here, if it could be prevented, they will teach in their academies and ongoing. They will teach their officers how to prevent this from happening, if possible. And that's what they'll take out of this. They'll use it as a case
Quentin
study.
Williams, thank you so much for being on the phone with us and kind of breaking this down. Attorney and former FBI agent with lots of knowledge as far as the law is concerned, and breaking down what this mistrial does mean for our area and for a case that has been very important over the past few weeks. Thank you so much, Quentin.
My pleasure.
All right, you guys, we want to bring you outside live, outside of the courthouse. That's where we have one of our reporters, Caitlin Lockerbie. She was inside the courthouse when this mistrial was declared just a few minutes ago. She's sort of gauging what's going on outside. Caitlin, what are you seeing?
Well, Jen, obviously several people upset about a mistrial in this case. After 4 days of deliberation, a jury finally deciding that there's just no movement, that a vote of 8-4 was all that they could come to. We have people lying in the street here outside of the courthouse. This is 4th Street outside of the Mecklenburg County Courthouse. Several people upset, yelling, "No justice, no peace." The Farrells walked out of the courtroom today. I followed them. They didn't want to talk to the media just yet, went into a side room upstairs in the courthouse. I haven't seen them come out just yet. Obviously, heavy media presence out here, as well as law enforcement. We've had law enforcement here outside the courthouse throughout the trial, but a very heavy presence today. Of course, as you can see, Stuart getting a shot here now. They are still lying in the street, several media surrounding them, protesters upset about this mistrial. And you just heard from legal experts, a lot of people anticipated this as the days went on in this trial, that they just couldn't come to an agreement. We heard today they made a vote on Tuesday, that jury 7-5. There was a little bit of movement on Thursday with a vote of 8-4. The judge did not want them to tell us whether or not they were leaning toward a guilty or not guilty verdict of voluntary manslaughter. So we don't know which way they were swaying. But of course, we will continue to keep you updated outside the courthouse as this day unfolds. We'll be talking to protesters, talking to jury members that want to talk to the media to keep you updated as to what's going on outside the courthouse. We're live outside the Mecklenburg County Courthouse. Caitlin Lockerbie, Fox 46 News.
Caitlin, I have a really quick question for you, and just to give everyone an idea of what's it like inside the courtroom, there's a media room right outside of the courtroom where most of us have been sitting for the past few weeks, and then of course you can be inside the courtroom itself. Were you inside the courtroom? Did you see the jury's faces at all when the judge was asking them what they wanted to do?
Jen, I was back and forth. I was actually in the media room as we heard the jury come back in. I went to go inside the courtroom, which was absolutely packed, and you have to be seated if you are inside the courtroom. So I went back to the media room so that I could listen to what was going on. You heard the foreman say, he was initially talking, saying that they just had exhausted all of their resources. They couldn't find any movement. He told the judge that coming back Monday, he didn't think was going to do anything, and then the jury all rose their hands in agreement. So it just appeared on their part that waiting more time wasn't going to help them come to any sort of conclusion altogether. So I sat in the media room. I didn't watch their faces. You could just hear in their voices that they really kind of had exhausted all levels that they could. And we heard from the defense, them saying that this jury worked really hard on this, both the state and the defense saying that these jurors worked hard to come to this conclusion. Obviously, the state wishing that they would work a little bit longer on this, but the judge determining that that just wasn't going to change their decision.
Caitlin Lockerbie, thank you so much for bringing us updates. You will be the eyes and the ears out there outside the Mecklenburg County Courthouse as we just anticipate a lot to happen in the next few hours. Thank you so much. We do want to bring you guys up to speed in case you were just catching up to this trial, kind of like what's been happening over the past 2 years. Randall Carrick, who you saw there, CMPD officer for many years, he is, or was charged rather, with voluntary manslaughter in the shooting death of Jonathan Farrell back in 2013. It would be 2 years this September. We just had closing arguments, but what happened that night was at 2:30 a.m. Jonathan Farrell knocked on a door after the accident, possibly seeking help. He had a car accident right there in that area. The defense arguing that he did not go about asking for help the right way. He knocked on a door. A resident saw him outside. The defense claiming he kicked that door, was very aggressive. That resident called 911 after she looked outside her front door and saw Jonathan Farrell covered in blood. That's when 3 officers arrived on that scene. Carrick was the second officer on that scene. We heard from all 3 officers, their testimony. At that point, the first officer, Officer Little, actually pulled his taser on Farrell, his taser gun, and it apparently had no effect. That's when Carrick then fired 12 shots at Jonathan Farrell. He was struck with 10 of those. At that point is when Carrick was put on unpaid leave following charges of voluntary manslaughter. And that dash cam video we did see, and that seems to be a point of contention between the jury because it was only recorded on one of those 3 police cars. So at that point, that was really all they had to go off on. So we want to now take you live right outside of the Mecklenburg County Courthouse. This is 4th Street, guys. Those are those protesters that are lying on the ground. They're saying something, justice. Maybe we can chime in to hear what they're chanting. We do know about a few groups that have been in the courtroom for the entire duration of this trial. One group, Black Lives Matter, another group, True Healing Under God. The True Healing Under God group has led a number of rallies and silent, peaceful protests for the Farrell family as they're going through all of this. And some of the members here, the protesters, are showing what they believe is their way of showing they don't think justice was served here. Of course, law enforcement has been preparing for the potential of some sort of a riot, some sort of violence, some sort of a situation after the verdict came down. And like you guys know, there was no verdict, a mistrial rather, so it leaves a little bit up in the air. We're going to pop out of this live shot. We actually have another expert here on the phone, Corey Rosensteel, an attorney here in Charlotte. We've been talking to him all along, kind of to pick his brain about what's been going on, but I'm curious to hear his reaction. Corey, how are you?
I'm fine, thank you.
What's your reaction? Were you kind of expecting this? Because we talked yesterday. I know it was kind of something we were all preparing for, but did you actually think we would be talking a mistrial right now?
Well, I don't think it's a real big surprise based on how the jury votes were coming down. When we knew that it was 4-8, and I think it was 5-7, I think that gave you a good idea that there was going to be some strong opinions in there. And when it's one or two people who are disagreeing, that's one thing. But when you've got a group of people in the room who are saying, I'm not going to change my vote, that gives you, as you can imagine as a juror, that gives you a backup. It gives you the opportunity to stick to your guns. So when you found out that you were talking about 4 or 5 people who were holdouts, that's less of a single holdout situation and more of two disparate groups who have very different ideas of how this should go.
So we actually are pulling up some live video. You see Randall Carrick about to walk out of the courtroom. Realistically, it could be for the very last time. What does this mean for Carrick as well as the Farrell family? Does this leave the door kind of open as far as not much closure to this?
Well, it's a really interesting situation on this one. What you would typically expect from a situation like this is that both parties would go back to the table and potentially negotiate more. And that's true whether you're talking about a civil trial or a criminal trial. Once you've got that done, now you know a lot more about the case, and you know a lot more about your exposure on the case. What you might expect from a prosecutor would be to give a better deal to the defendant. You might expect the defendant to be willing to take a deal that he wouldn't have taken before because now he knows there are people who believed he was guilty. But in this case, I think you're dealing with some real political concerns that may govern how this trial could go, or how this situation could go. And of course, I'm not going to comment on those, but I think that could be a real driving force behind this.
I'm curious, in the former trials that you've worked, kind of similar to this, especially ones with murder charges, when the judge talked about bringing the jury to the attorneys to talk about where they were at as far as, was there a larger group who thought he was not guilty and a smaller group who thought he was guilty, or vice versa? Is that successful? Does that help the prosecution decide whether or not they should try this case again?
It can give, anytime you give the prosecution more information on what happened in the back room, it gives them a better idea of whether they should move forward or not. Certainly, there are times when the prosecution is going to feel like we had one holdout juror who was he was a rogue. When you're dealing with a situation where maybe you had one guy who just said, boy, I'm not going to give up on this. I don't believe that they proved their case. Well, that's obviously going to be a different situation than when you've got a group of people, whether those people have something in common or whether they don't, who say the way we see this case is he was not guilty. That's going to lead you as a prosecutor to believe there's a lot more exposure to an acquittal verdict, and that there's a lot more doubt in the case. and that's going to drive you more than if you think you have just one single juror who's a holdout, who's you can quote unquote label as a crazy or label as a as an outlier.
Corey, I have one really quick question for you, and partially because you are an attorney here in Charlotte, so you kind of have a gauge of how this could potentially affect additional cases involving CMPD officers, how this could affect the policy that CMPD operates under. What are your thoughts on how this trial could potentially change the scope of Charlotte?
Well, I think that you've seen a lot of changes already. I mean, the police chief is no longer who was responsible when he was indicted is no longer the police chief. So I don't know what kind of factor what that had to do with this situation or how that related. But certainly, I think there are some people who are raising that as an issue there. Certainly, I think that people looked at this case and said this was a rapid indictment. And they certainly looked at this case, and I think that after the evidence has been out, I think there's certainly some dispute as to what the policy was and how well it was implemented for deadly force. And I think they're certainly going to be going back and looking over that. This cost the city, it cost the state a lot of money to prosecute this. And the fact of the matter is, whether Randall Carrick was guilty or not, we've got a dead young man. And I think that should prompt the city to take a look at this a lot more closely, and their policies and the policies of CMPD in particular.
Corey, thank you so much. I also want to thank you for being our phone a friend for the past few weeks, because we've certainly used your expertise and your guidance as you've kind of broken down what's been going on in this trial. Thank you so much.
Happy to do it.
All right, we're going to take you back out live outside the Mecklenburg County Courthouse. That's where Caitlin Lockerbie is, and that's where those protesters were laying on the ground, from what I understand. She now is there live with a protester. Caitlin, go ahead.
Well, Jenny, that protest is still going on here on 4th Street. You can see people are still lying in the street. They've been yelling Jonathan Ferrell's name, as well as Black Lives Matter, as well as no justice, no peace. I'm joined here by Paris Bay, who's obviously upset about this mistrial verdict today. You've been here throughout the trial. Talk a little bit about what you've watched in the courtroom and how what this day means to you.
Well, this day means a lot to me because we didn't get a chance to, take the guy that shot my cousin, Janisha Fonville, to trial. And I really felt like it was going to be a verdict and that he would be convicted today. And we're all out here emotional right now. Like, it's people that's not even related to us that came from New York. And they're emotional, crying because the justice system is just not fair.
We've heard from legal experts throughout this trial, and the longer this trial went on, the longer it took the jurors to come back with a decision. What were your thoughts? Did you think that they would come back with a guilty verdict?
When it took this long, I did have suspicion that it wasn't going to come back a guilty verdict, but I prayed that something was going to change, something. But since it was a mistrial, maybe they can do another trial and probably get a guilty verdict out of that.
What do you want to tell the Ferrell family?
I want to tell them that I'm sorry. Like, I feel them. I mean, I talked with the Ferrell family. I sat down with them. So we both know our situations, and they are a loving family. They got a boy taken away from them. His mother, I mean, it's hard. And I just want to tell them, we're not giving up, and we know they're not going to give up either.
Paris, thank you for joining us. I appreciate it. Obviously, heavy emotions on both sides. We will be continuing to follow the reaction here outside the courthouse. But for now, Jen, I'm going to send it back into you in the studio.
Caitlin, thank you so much. And we're actually going to send it right back to the Mecklenburg County Courthouse on the other side by the entrance. Listen up. This is the podium addressing security questions.
Was there a little, obviously, more heightened awareness of just making sure you had extra?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, we're going to make sure we have the people here. And again, it's just about keeping this community safe, and we're doing it. So thank you very much. I appreciate it.
All right, we'll bring you guys up to date on what was said there in that press conference. We do know there were some changes made outside of the courthouse as far as moving dumpsters, moving trash cans, anything to sort of prepare for the potential of large crowds who could still at this point show up outside of the courthouse. But we obviously don't know if that is going to happen. Again, I'm certain that a lot of people were expecting some sort of a verdict out of this trial when we first talked many months ago and the big preparation for this trial. But again, to bring you guys up to date, if you're just tuning in with us right now, Officer Randall Carrick, the trial we've been following for quite some time now, a judge declaring it a mistrial because the jury could just not come to an agreement on this. The numbers changing throughout the week as far as the jury votes were concerned. The last check today, 8-4. Obviously, we don't know if the 8 people were going to charge him and say he was guilty, or if 4 people were going to say he was not guilty. At that point, we will eventually get that information as the prosecution needs it, as there's a potential they could retry this case depending on where the jury was at. Take a live look here right now. These are protesters lying outside on 4th Street. They're actually on the street that's right outside of the courthouse. This is as much as we see right now as far as some sort of a protest. At this point, it appears to be peaceful. They are chanting Black Lives Matter, and I'm assuming a few of those people are with the group Black Lives Matter. They have been also sitting in the courtroom for about the 5 weeks that they have been in this trial. There's another group as well, True Healing Under God. They've led a number of rallies and protests leading up to this trial as well as during the trial. They will also have some sort of a rally, a come together as soon as all of today wraps up. I think people are still trying to decide where the jury was at and why they could not come to an agreement. They were presented with a lot of evidence in this case. And you have to remember, when you have a jury of 12 people, it takes one person to not agree, and you have a hung jury. And from the sounds of it, the foreman telling us that he just thought they had exhausted all of their options at that point, and that's the agreement they came to, and the judge declaring this a mistrial here in the Carrick trial. All right, you guys, in just a few minutes, we're actually hoping to talk and hear from the Carrick family as they come out of the courthouse. They're not quite out there yet, but we will bring you the very latest in a little over an hour on our 6 o'clock news right here on Fox 46. Thanks for checking in with us.